Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here in Washington, D.C., where we're at the Stroock Stroock Lavan law firm in order to talk to some of the nation's leading minds on CIFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, including Chris Griner, who's a partner here, and Chris Brewster, who's a special counsel. And Chris, you're one of the guys who spent decades and a career, paving the way for international companies in the defense and aerospace space. To come to the United States, whether or to expand their presence or to strike deals here, and it's a very dynamic time. Folks are more concerned than ever about China and China's investment in the United States. We've also got some companies that have not necessarily been, in specifically the space, which is the Japanese, who after decades of seeing other guys do it, are looking at increasing their footprint in the United States. And anytime something like this happens, you want to make sure that the United States is protecting its equities, while at the same time not foreclosing opportunities for investment in the United States. Bring us up to speed on some of the things that are going on in the CFIUS space right now, whether it's on the legislative side, whether it's on the government policy side, especially after the last administration said no to a few transactions that involved Chinese that were seen or the concern was that they were being done for espionage reasons rather than pure investment, as the wind farm, out west that was in close proximity to a Navy base.
Exactly. Well, it's very nice to talk with you about this, Vago. Frankly, CIFIUS, Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, has been around for a long time. Chris and I were in the very beginnings of it. We've been very much involved with making this help develop it and how it's been involving. It used to be, frankly, considering national security, defense, and then telecommunications, and now it's expanded with the FINSA, Foreign Investment and National Security Act, to be critical infrastructure. And so that's really expanded. It's great for business because it expanded the horizons of areas that are being considered. Very active right now. It's been, frankly, this year looking to be more than 200 filings, quite significant from last year. The big change has been, of course, China. There's been a variety of companies that have been here, the usual suspects from Europe, but the Chinese have been coming in most recently and putting a great amount of money and investment. So it's a new time, and the increased investment has caused a dynamic of what is happening. As you said, if you're coming in for good business reasons, you're welcomed, but if you're coming in for other reasons, that's some of the suspect situation. So some of the transactions that have been reviewed and go on for a long period, there's a transaction for one set, like a 30 to 45 day, but some have gone on for as much as 4 times those sets. So it shows that the government is really concerned about how it works, and the timing has been difficult for companies to get a deal done. So there's been a lot of things happening. But I think the important thing is that new legislation is coming down because of that concern to do things correctly. CIFIUS has a lot of power, but there's a desire to try to make the legislation change to reflect the new dynamics involving China. The first legislation came about because of the Japanese buying in many years ago. They were going to take over America, and then obviously Dubai ports, which was the UAE, and now the China, I think, is the impetus for that process, which Chris has been really studying quite a bit about this and knows quite a bit. Maybe you could talk about the legislation, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask you because there is so much going on the legislative front, and if you could bring us up to speed on that, that'd be terrific.
Well, the key legislation was introduced by John Cornyn, the majority whip, and the bill was in development for easily 6 months. Working with Treasury, working with a lot of outside counsel who are involved in the process. What Senator Cornyn is trying to do is to expand the scope of CIFIUS review into areas that historically have not been subject to CIFIUS jurisdiction. So, for example, he's proposed that CIFIUS look at investments that do not involve takeovers, mergers, control, but rather investments that result in access by foreign investors to key critical technology. He's also talking about first expressly extending CIFIUS review to look at the proximity of an acquisition to key government installations. That was a key issue in one of the cases vetoed by President Obama. But also he would extend it to include leases that are given to foreign parties that are near government installations. That's the first time we've ever gone into the lease field. So real estate, which was an area that was frankly, pretty much off limits for decades, within the last 5-6 years has become more and more and more a focus of CIFIUS review.
Let me ask you about investment. Right at the Reagan National Defense Forum, Raj Shah, the chief of the Defense Innovation Unit Experimental out in Silicon Valley, raised the sheer amount of Chinese venture capital that's flowing into the United States. That he said once upon a time in this space, it was 6% Chinese money, and now you're looking at 15% Chinese money. What's the right way to manage that? Because everybody wants access to capital, and if you're a smart guy who's coming into a space and making that capital available, ordinarily there are a lot of guys who would jump at that opportunity to welcome the money. Money is increasingly fluid, and the fact that it comes from China does not necessarily mean that it's controlled by the People's Liberation Army or the government, given the massive tech sector in China that actually looks at its own government as an impediment half the time. What's the right balance point on this as somebody who spent, as you have, a career sort of balancing America's national interest with the, sort of the legitimate interests of folks who are investors who want to invest in the United States?
Yeah, it's a very interesting program. I mean, frankly, many times in the past, in some cases, frankly, many Chinese companies new to the culture did not file CFIUS because it's voluntary. So that was a mistake, because the government will come after you and say, why didn't you file? And that means file, or they can file themselves. So that's a problem. The other thing is, having some analysis ahead of time. When someone is coming in, looking at the companies, you're right. If it's certainly, forget the government, the military, but it's a state-owned company, that is something which people look at a little more askance. The government's more concerned. Doesn't mean it can't be done, but that raises the level of concern. The issue, though, is, of course, looking at the company you're buying, making sure that you're not, as we're finding, semiconductors. That's just really a red line. Do not do that one. It's the third rail. But there are other companies and other areas, things that get involved with personal identifier information, things that you wouldn't think about. Chris and I have been involved in some very interesting cases in these different areas where that information came up, and if you don't handle it properly, you can run into problems. You really want to prepare ahead of time. You don't want to rush into it. We've had clients that come in and say, file immediately, and we say, no. You need to prepare the documents, do a pre-filing, let the government come back to you with their concerns, and then but it's being prepared. That's the key, and look for the problems and have somebody being the devil's advocate.
One of the things that I think is important for people to remember is that while China has led in the number of CFIUS reviews for the last 3 to 4 years, we're talking maybe 22, 25, 26 reviews out of 140, 160, 180, now up to 200. So while, yes, China's accounting for a lot of reviews, there are still an awful lot of other foreign investments that are getting reviewed by CFIUS. So the fact that investment is coming from Europe, coming from the UK, coming from the Five Eyes, that doesn't mean that it's not going to get looked at. It's also important to note that there still are going to be cases that don't warrant CFIUS review because the national security interest is just too attenuated. And then there are also mitigating steps that firms can take. Chris was just talking about planning up front. So you have to look critically at the deal and say, all right, where are the vulnerabilities? What would I be concerned about if I were a government reviewer? And address that up front. That may mean getting rid of a particular line of business that isn't particularly important to the deal anyway, but that could trigger a lot of national security concern.
One, not a point of failure, but a challenge point in this is the office in the Pentagon that actually oversees the CFIUS process for the department, and that's the Industrial Manufacturing and Industrial Base Policy Office. Eric Tuning, formerly of McKinsey, is now in that office. He and Ellen Lord have a great relationship, as we certainly saw over at the Reagan Forum. And Eric's office is going to play an even more, it has always played a critical role, especially when it's as busy as it is. Does the government, and I want to get your take on this, Chris, about what Congress is willing to do about this, from a resources perspective, does the government have the resources? Because we've seen this time and again, whether it's for foreign military sales cases, whether it's for export licensing, where the limitation is the number of people in the government who have the wherewithal, the experience, the smarts, and the judgment, or perhaps I should say the training and the judgment, to be able to make the right decisions about what actually constitutes a national security risk and what doesn't.
No, that's a very good point. And frankly, the reason I mentioned about these cases going on a lot longer, normally it was a 30-day, many clients, the usual suspects, serial filers from the UK, they come in, they file, they go, it would take a 30-day review. Now it goes 30 days to another 45 days, not because it's a difficult case, but because if you prepare ahead of time. I always say I don't want to file until I know what the answer is. Get it all together, work with the staff officer. But the staff, there aren't enough staff at CIFIUS, and certainly at DOD, and DOD is sort of the major player within CIFIUS, but the staff people within the Committee on Foreign Investment at Treasury, there aren't enough people there to do this, so things get jammed up due to nothing more than personnel, staffing, and everything else. We have people that work round the clock on these cases, trying to do the best they can. They're very good. They've got good questions, but that is indeed a real problem, let alone the complexities. I mean, some of these cases used to be, as I say, defense, and then how do you expand from that to the critical infrastructure, doing the analysis, making sure you get the right answers. That's a really important key.
Well, and just to clarify for our audience, the CFIUS process is overseen by the Treasury Department, but the Pentagon plays a key role on national security issues and feed into that process about what constitutes a risk or not. Chris, from a legislative perspective, are lawmakers aware of some of these challenges? I know that you guys are in regular contact with members. You certainly are. Do folks recognize that, and are more resources going to be made available? Even though it's not a lot, it often takes Congress to say, hey, guys, look, there's a problem here, and you guys have to apply resources to solve it.
Yeah, there are a couple of things that the Cornyn bill certainly is trying to do. One is they're creating a new process, which is a process whereby firms can file short-form declarations that say, this is the deal we're planning to do, and CFIUS is given the authority to review it and close it out inside of 30 days. So that's new, and we expect that probably what Chris calls serial filers, the firms that are well known to CFIUS, are going to be the ones that will probably be heavy users there. So that may get rid of some cases more quickly than might be the case otherwise. They're also introducing for the first time a filing fee, which will be either 1% of the transaction or $300,000, whatever is less, but that's new money coming in for the purpose of helping to support this effort. And they do provide for, although they don't authorize, but they do provide for authorization for increased staffing. So all of that's frankly pretty critical to the process because, as Chris says, over the last 30 years, we've seen these cases become more and more complex. I mean, now CFIUS is looking closely at artificial intelligence. They're looking at access to personal identifying information. These are issues that, 25 years ago weren't really on the radar.
Well, and there were even some people who said that when Smithfield was bought, Smithfield Foods, or Smithfield Hams, I should say, there were folks who said, well, look, that's a food security issue, and shouldn't we be looking at whether or not China, and we actually know people who will not buy Smithfield Hams now because they're owned by Chinese. Could there be an even further expansion, for example, into foods and things like that where we've normally not seen this?
Yes, and Senator Grassley has introduced legislation to add the Secretary of Agriculture to the CFIUS committee. And also to add the Secretary of HHS for the purpose of looking at food security issues. So things like that could very well come up during the course of the debate. As legislation proceeds, you're going to see a lot of Me Too proposals that are going to come down the pike. Senator Grassley and Senator Brown just recently introduced legislation to require a review of the economic impact of transactions, separate and apart from the national security considerations. So all of this, is going to sort of get thrashed out. Our expectation is this bill is going to pass in some way, shape, or form by the end of of this Congress, end of 2018, and we're going to see, some new initiatives that are going to go into areas that we just haven't looked at before.
An important piece of this is, as Chris was bringing up, the fact that now they're bringing in the issue of commerce versus national security. Up until this point, when the legislation has been reviewed several times, it's been continuing to be national security legislation. And people elsewhere would say, what's going on? I said, well, it's a national security determination. And they've been very clear not to bring in other issues. But there is this pressure to build. The problem is, of course, you don't want to kill the golden goose. You've got great foreign investment. You've got Select USA out there promoting foreign investment to the United States. You want to be very careful that you don't produce something which really totally adversely affects good investment, good business people coming in with good protections should be allowed forward. Those that have problems and issues can be mitigated, and then some, then they find, shouldn't go forward. But
I'm sorry, but it's worth noting that Senator Cornyn, when they introduced the bill, put out a statement of explanation along with it and pointedly said, we're not going into economic security. And the reason that he did that was to make clear, I think, to those that were concerned that that's where the bill was headed, that was off limits. But Senator Brown is the ranking Democrat on the committee that will consider this bill. He's the chief co-sponsor of the Grassley legislation. I expect that he's probably going to expect this final bill to have something to say about economic security.
And that's an issue that he's been actually pretty hawkish on. Chris, should there be a frequent buyers plan? I mean, there are so many British companies that have been such steady investors, particularly in this space. Should there be some sort of certification that goes to a company and said, look, this guy's a good citizen or gal's a good citizen. We know what they're up to. We know what they're trying to do. Their investments have been beneficial for U.S. national security, and that there could be a fast track for them as they go through the process.
Very much so. I think, frankly, we've been talking about that idea to allow those people, one, who've been vetted, two, that come from countries that are comfortable, three, really they've done this before. So if you've been in fact, many times I'll say to people when they want to do a big deal, I said, do a little one. Let the government see who you are and understand who you are. Frankly, those people that have been doing this routinely and have been good citizens, good practitioners, and frankly, that's one of the things I'm talking with China. We're trying to help them be good citizens by coming in and learning the rules and regulations. They made some mistakes in the beginning by not having filed. And the issue now, frankly, we find almost people filing in cases we're saying, really? Why? Because they are concerned about having a problem. But I think definitely there should be a way of some process of people that have been there before. Obviously, things change, so you need to have an intelligence assessment. You need to make sure things are continuing the way they should be. But it's good for the government. It cuts back on the number of people that need to do this, the timing that it takes. It allows deals to get done faster. At the same time, you know the same facts, so people are working with the same information. And so a fast-track filing would be a very good thing to do, I think, all around for the government as well as for the private companies.
Let me ask one last question to both of you. And even though knowing that you guys are one of the top firms in this space, so I'm not trying to tip a hand for anything that any of your potential clients have already put in front of you. But once upon a time, if you went back 30 years, I remember when Thomson wanted to buy LTV, and it was a gigantic show. There were friends of mine on the American side of it years later told me the role that they played, even though on many cases the transaction would have been a decent transaction ultimately, and not jeopardized American national security. We saw the Airbus BAE deal fall apart because of domestic German reasons more than anything else. And there were people on this side who said, boy, that absolved the United States for having made a decision. But there were a couple of people involved in government who said, we really didn't see a major problem with a deal like that going forward. There's a lot of M&A activity that has been announced. There's much more M&A activity that's expected to be announced. Do you guys, after decades of doing this, see that standards, approaches, thinking about these deals has so fundamentally changed that an Airbus may be able to come into the United States or a Thales come into the United States and strike a very, very major deal and it not even raise an eyebrow ultimately?
I think they can do the deals. Raising an eyebrow, there's obviously going to be review. Each country has its own dynamics. But frankly, that is an important piece of how this can be done. I think there's more of an education. Before it was like very, very difficult to get a big company. We were involved in the first big company transaction many years ago, and now it's routine. So there's a lot of things. We've a variety of people that are at the various different levels with security arrangements. Foreign ownership, control, or influence has now been well honed. There's a variety of new opportunities to develop that to make it better and more useful to the company and better to the government. So I do think that the transactions would require some vetting and significant review, but I think quite possibly could be done.
Yeah, I agree with Chris. I mean, we now have 25, 30 plus years of experience of dealing on some very highly classified contracts with foreign-controlled companies. That wasn't true back when we first got started in this process. And that includes areas that are, would have been considered completely off limits at one point. There were, various times, way back when there were government reviewers who would say, foreign control is never going to happen on my watch. You don't see that as much anymore because I think that first, people have gotten comfortable with it. And second of all, it's been seen that in many cases, what that means is better technology, more growth, good jobs in the United States. And so the threat, I think, is perceived differently today than it was 25 years ago.
Chris Brewster, special counsel. Chris Griner, partner here at Stroock Stroock and Lavan. Gentlemen, thanks very much, and look forward to having you on, and hope both of you have a great holiday and a Happy New Year.
Thank you very much.